First of all, thanks to everyone for being here. It's great to see such a large number of people coming for this very important event. My name is Rivka Barnard, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and I'll be chairing this meeting tonight on the topic of Palestinian prisoners of apartheid demanding justice. So just something about this event. It's co-hosted by my organization, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and our close partner here in the UK, War on Want. And I'm really happy to say that my colleague Chi Shi from War on Want is also one of our speakers this evening. Over the weekend, on the 17th of April, Palestinians and the broader solidarity movement marked Prisoners' Day, which is a really significant point in the calendar each year when Palestinians draw attention to and honor the cause of the thousands of Palestinian political prisoners held by Israel and use the day to elevate their demand for freedom and justice. Israel currently holds several thousand Palestinians as political prisoners, including hundreds who are held in administrative detention. And of course, children are not spared this horrible treatment. I think our speakers will attest to shortly, Israel's consistent use of arrest and detention is not simply a case of individualized targeting. It's a form of collective repression and a part of a wider set of interlocking systems of oppression, settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid. These past 2 years, we've seen a number of reports by human rights groups and by UN human rights experts detailing how Israel's system of control over Palestinians fits the legal definition of apartheid. And indeed, this is something that Palestinians have been calling our attention to for decades. For the purpose of today's topic, I want to call your attention to some of the particular elements of the crime of apartheid. So the International Convention on Apartheid specifies that that crime of apartheid includes the use of torture, the use of arbitrary detention, and the persecution of people on the basis of their opposition to apartheid. So there's no doubt that Israel's system of arrest and detention of Palestinians is used as a tool of political repression, of collective punishment, in an attempt to terrorize Palestinians, in an attempt to scare them into submission, to convince them to give up their struggle against apartheid and their struggle for freedom and self-determination. But despite decades and decades of devastating mass incarceration, the Palestinian people have not given up their struggle, and they commemorate Prisoners' Day every year as a moment to rally around the human rights defenders, the journalists, the student activists, the community health practitioners, the lawyers, and the myriad of others, including the many children who are targeted with arrest. So to rally around them and to uplift the call to free the political prisoners and to end occupation and apartheid. So even in the darkness, there are moments of beautiful resistance to be inspired by, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panel tonight about the ways that prisoners support each other and are supported by the broader Palestinian community and the broader solidarity community in the face of so much oppression. Now I want to introduce our very, very esteemed guests for this evening, along with Chi Shi, who I've already introduced from War on Want. We have two guest speakers joining us from Palestine. The first is Melina Ansari. She's the International Advocacy Officer at Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association based in Palestine. And Ayed Abuaktash is the Accountability Program Director at Defense for Children International Palestine. Both Adamir and DCI Palestine are really at the forefront of the work to support the prisoners' demand for justice. These are organizations that are rooted in the community in Palestine, and that makes them really the best place to speak to us on these issues tonight. And we're really, really proud to partner with them and to take leadership from them on our campaigns. I personally know the staff of these two organizations, and I can tell you that they do not rest. They're constantly working in overdrive to do this really critical support work supporting the families of those imprisoned, the parents of kids whose childhoods are being lost behind bars, to visit with the prisoners themselves and to provide them with legal support, as well as doing the documentation, the evidence collection, and speaking and sharing their expertise in international forums, including like the event that we're having here tonight. So we're incredibly lucky to have them with us today, and for them to be sharing their time with us. So just, I want to make a note on the format of this event, because it's going to be a little bit different maybe than some of the other ones that you've been in. We're going to make this a sort of roundtable discussion with the panel. So I'm going to ask a round of questions to the speakers, and we won't have a question and answer period at the end because our time is so limited and we really want to hear as much as possible from our speakers. But if you do have any burning questions, you can use the chat function to send them to me. And if we have time at the end, I can pose those questions to the speakers. I do want to mention also that we're live streaming this event on Facebook. So if there's anybody that you know wanted to be here and couldn't make it, you can direct them to our Facebook page, and we'll also be recording it afterwards. So I think that's all of the sort of admin details I wanted to mention. And I think without further ado, then I'm going to get right into the first round of questions with our wonderful panel. So Milena, I'm going to start with you and ask if you could please give us a status update on what the situation is for prisoners right now, the numbers, the trends, and what are the most pressing issues of concern from the view of your work.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Rivka, for the wonderful opening statement and your kind words. Truly, the honor is mine to be here, and thank you everyone for joining in. About the situation now in Palestine and relating to Palestinian political prisoners. So since the beginning of this year, 2022, the Israeli occupation forces have arrested over 2,140 Palestinians, the majority of which took place in Jerusalem, in the occupied cities of Jerusalem and Jenin. So arrests escalated basically last month of March 2022, leading up to the beginning of the holy month in Ramadan. It reached its peaks of arrests from this year 5 days ago on the 15th of March, when the Israeli occupation forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque during the dawn prayer, where they also arrested over 400 Palestinian civilians, and many of them were children. So these scale of attacks and increasing arrests in Jerusalem remind us also of last year, of May 2021, when the Israeli occupation forces also intensified their aggression in Jerusalem, which led to the Palestinian, what we called it, unity uprising, where Israel launched a series of violent attacks against Palestinians all across the occupied Palestine. So this systematic behavior by the Israeli occupation is really important to always shed light to. It's not as occurrences of different events. They are all part of the Israeli occupation's goal to maintain control over the Palestinian people as part of its settler, colonial, and apartheid regime. And what I mean by that is the Israeli occupation doesn't allow Palestinians to enjoy any moment and to live in liberty and dignity. Even at the holiest month, there would be arbitrary arrests in the city of Jerusalem. So currently, there are 4,450 prisoners, of which are 32 Palestinian women and 530 administrative detainees. What it means to be an administrative detainee is to be held for an indefinite time without any charges presented against you, or without a fair trial happening. So basically, the Israeli occupation alleges that a person may impose a future threat against the security of Israel, and under secret information, they should be detained for an indefinite time in order to allegedly avoid the security threat on the state of Israel. And currently, there are 530 Palestinians under administrative detention. The last statistics, so I don't trouble you with so much numbers, are the Palestinian Legislative Council members. And this is important to note that they are only held because they are political figures in Palestine. So there is no way to exercise any right of self-determination. 5 of the 8 Palestinian Legislative Council members are held under administrative detention, no charge, no trial, but only secret information. Just briefly, if I have time, I'll just talk about the detention conditions, because that's mainly the advocacy work that Al-Damir focuses on, is the ill treatment leading up to the detention and the detention conditions themselves. The Israeli occupation is bound by the use of torture and ill treatment against Palestinians, especially during the interrogation. And as Rivka mentioned, these policies are not only subjected to one Palestinian, but regardless, either by gender or age, all Palestinians are face torture and ill treatment during interrogations, either if it was physical or even psychological. And against children, maybe Ayed would cover this more, but even children are subjected to more psychological torture, which really affects their upgrowing. And it's a form to maintain control over the youth, which are the future of a Palestinian, of Palestine. Other than the torture and ill treatment, prisoners inside prisons are subjected to collective punishment and solitary confinement. We've seen the escalation of these two policies being used after the Galboa escape last year. We're following the recapture of the prisoners. The majority of prisoners who were affiliated to the same political groups were put in solitary confinement, and collective punishment measures were enforced on all prisoners, where the Israeli prison services threatened to impose a policy where every 6 months the detainees and the prisoners would change their places so they won't stay in one prison for more than 6 months. I'll give the floor back to Rivka, and we can talk more about administrative detention in military courts coming soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Milena. And yeah, thank you for giving that overview. So Ayed, if it's okay, I'll come to you next. And I wanted to ask, sort of within the context of what Milena has described, what is the status of children, and for the children that that you're supporting at DCI Palestine, what are some of the most urgent issues that you're seeing?
Thank you, Rivka. Thank you for Palestine Solidarity Campaign and War on Want for the opportunity to brief you about the situation facing Palestinian children in Israeli military legal system. As Milena mentioned, that Palestinian children are not spared from these practices. They are exposed to the same types of ill treatment and torture like adult, and under this situation, it's continuation for the situation under the Israeli. It's not reaction to a specific time or period, but these practices intensified whenever there is uprising or tension in the political situation. So whenever there is tension, political tension, the arrest among Palestinians in general and children in particular become more and more. At the time being, we estimate that the number of Palestinian children who are in the Israeli military legal system around 160 Palestinian children. And every year, the Israeli authorities arrest, interrogate, and prosecute around 700 Palestinian children in the military legal system that lack all fair trial guarantees. And according to our documentation, almost every Palestinian child who is interrogated by the Israeli authorities exposed to at least one type of ill treatment and torture. The types of ill treatment and torture that Palestinian children exposed to varied. They use different types like physical violence, like slapping, kicking, punching, forcing children to sit in uncomfortable position, and most importantly, the issue of psychological pressure that Palestinian children exposed to during interrogation, and mainly the issue of placing Palestinian children in solitary confinement during interrogation, and to extract confessions from Palestinian children that later on will be used as a primary evidence before the Israeli military legal system. And whenever the Israeli authorities fail in extracting confessions from Palestinian children, they impose administrative detention against them. So, for example, during the period between October 2015 until now, we documented the cases of 42 Palestinian children who were placed under administrative detention orders. Last year, we documented the cases of 6 Palestinian children who were placed under administrative detention. So most importantly, that these practices, it's not the practices of individual Israeli soldier, it's part and parcel of the strategy of the Israeli state and how to use the issue of imprisonment as a tool for suppressing and controlling people who are living under its occupation.
Thank you for that, Ayad. And yeah, really interesting to hear both of you saying, first of all, that this isn't a time specific. This is something that's kind of spanned the decades, and also that it's systematic. I think that's a really important thing to take away from what both of you have said. Chichi, if I can turn to you next. You've written quite a bit about this in a report that War on Want published last spring about Israel's system of military courts. And as a part of that report, you wrote about the British origins of some of the systems in place. So I wondered if you could share with us some of that history, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rivka. So yeah, Britain has played historically a really pivotal role in the dispossession of Palestine, and it goes back over a century as part of Britain's global colonial history. And so the Balfour Declaration in 1917 first saw Britain lay claim to Palestine as part of empire expansion, and this paved the way for the Israeli settler colonialism that continues still today. So in 1917, Britain invaded and occupied Palestine and would go on to rule it under the British mandate until 1948. This was a mandate that included support for the eventual establishment of a Jewish homeland on Palestinian land. Some of the tactics that were used by the British and the systems of rule that were put in place by the British mandate were then later adopted by the nascent Israeli state. So in the late 1930s, there was a mass Palestinian uprising known as the Arab Uprising against the British mandate, the proposed partition of Palestine and Zionist colonization that they could see happening at the time. In 1937, the British, in response to the uprising, introduced martial law and a whole set of repressive measures that was intended to repress Palestinian resistance to British colonial rule. So the British crackdown included policies that are still used by Israel in Palestine today. So it includes administrative detention, the use of military courts, punitive home demolitions, night squads, and collective punishment of the entire population. So by 1939, around 9,000 Palestinians were actually being held in British detention camps. The kind of repressive tactics that Israel uses today, we can see them were first practiced by the British mandate. And also during this time, the British were collaborating with and training Zionist militias that were operating in Palestine, and that would later become the Israeli army. So there's actually a direct link there with how the British taught tactics of how to deal with insurgency and revolt by using collective punishment and preemptive punitive action. And yeah, we can see that these are still being used today. So legally, in 1945, some of these repressive measures were codified into law in what's known as the Defense Emergency Regulations. These regulations are still the colonial legal framework that is being used by Israel. So following the establishment of Israel in 1948, they adapted and codified these regulations into Israeli law. And ever since, these have been used to impose military rule internally on Palestinians. But for its Jewish citizens, Israel actually went on to develop a code of civil law, which is now now there are like two codes for two peoples, which is an apartheid regime of control, where we can see that people living in the same place are subject to separate codes of law depending on their identity. So yeah, we can see here that the line of British complicity is like flows through like very strongly, and it's something that absolutely continues to this day. And the British government continues to supply weapons and training used in the repression of the Palestinian people. And so, yeah, it's really important for us just to understand this history in order to understand the present and to locate what's happening in Palestine within this kind of global history of colonialism, and to understand that these tactics aren't just used in Palestine now, and they weren't just used in Palestine then, but there are techniques that are used for colonial domination around the world. And yeah, it should emphasize for us the urgency of ending this complicity now, today. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Back to you, Rivka.
Thanks, Chi-Chi, and definitely I encourage everyone to take a look at that report by War on Want about the military courts. Maybe we'll put it in the chat. It's a really good overview of some of the issues that we're talking about today, and certainly has a lot of inputs both from Damir and Defense for Children International Palestine too. So I want to go to the next round of questions. We've heard a bit now about the sort of the dire conditions that prisoners are facing, and I wanted to pivot now to speak about the resistance, the spirit of resistance in the prisoners movement. Damir has been talking a lot about the administrative detainees' boycott of confirmation hearings. So Milena, can you tell us more about that? When did that begin, what's happening with it, and how does that relate to things like hunger strikes, actions that prisoners are taking to raise their cause?
To better understand the boycott and the importance of the boycott that's happening now by around 530 Palestinian administrative detainees, it's important to focus on the policy of administrative detention and what it is, how the Israeli occupation have used it as a systematic tool to maintain control and to arbitrarily arrest Palestinians without any charges or any allegations presented against them. So as Chi-Chi mentioned, many of these policies are taken from the British mandate on Palestine, and administrative detention, as mentioned, is mainly one of them. Where the Israeli occupation just uses Israeli military orders without any charges or any evidence based on secret information. But in the past 5 years, the Israeli authorities have used it in a more widespread way to target Palestinian human rights defenders, civil society workers, children, and students. So mainly anyone where the military prosecutor can't fulfill a list of charges or can't provide a list of charges, they have been using this legal loophole to just detain Palestinians, alleging that they have secret information against them that say they may impose a future risk. So the Palestinians inside prison and the administrative detainees realize that this policy of administrative detention is only increasing more and more to target more Palestinians. So hunger strikes emerged as a first way to protest against the policy of administrative detention, where the detainees use their own bodies to become to change the power dynamics between the prison guards and the occupation and themselves and their liberty. So hunger strikes is a form to protest administrative detention. But in the past 2 years, we have seen many individual hunger strikes emerge, where the detainees put their bodies at imminent risk in order for their liberty. But the Israeli occupation found more loopholes in Israeli military courts to avoid holding the responsibility of a detainee's life, where they started freezing the administrative detention order. So the responsibility of the prisoner is on the hospital and not the prison services. Why I'm mentioning this is to lead up to why are they boycotting military courts now, is because it's part of the integral role that the judicial system has in approving the administrative detention orders, in confirming them and renewing them without even asking the question of, do you have any secret information? Does the alleged threat that they impose, is it still there? No one questions. So the judicial review is also something of a mockery. It doesn't follow any fair trial standards. It doesn't follow any justice. So the hunger strike to focus on the illegality and the unjust of Israeli military courts. So in administrative detention, the illegality expands where there's a fake judicial review happening. And basically the military judge just approves whatever the military commander issues. But regarding the list of charges against prisoners when it's not administrative detention, there's always fair trial violations, where the language used is Hebrew, where the law used is Israeli military laws, where the judge is an Israeli occupation forces, for part of the Israeli occupation army, and the prosecutor is part of the Israeli army as well. So the whole system is intertwined together to portray this mockery of a trial, to keep on maintaining control over the Palestinians without even following any law or any rule of law at all. So the boycott includes all military courts at all levels. No Palestinian lawyer is representing any administrative detainee. This also includes appeals. So orders are being confirmed in absentia without the detainee being present or their lawyer. Of course, this is extremely violating fair trial, because now there is no one defending any Palestinians, and the orders are just being confirmed. And to wrap up about the boycott, and just to link it to the prisoner movement, inside prison, the administrative detainees are also taking collective and organized measures against administrative detention, where they are collectively refusing meals on a certain period of days, or sick prisoners are refusing to take medicine in certain times. So there is an organized and collective measure happening against Israeli military courts, and the prisoners are really against this policy and want to shed light on it. So it's only fair that us who are outside prison to really highlight the urgency of the integral role of Israeli military courts. It's on us to also highlight that detainees are being detained without any charges just because basically they are Palestinians. They may have opposed the occupation in a social media post, or in like Al-Damir or Al-Haq, by their legitimate human rights work. So we need to shed light at this apparatus, the whole apartheid regime that has been established for a long time now. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Milena, and certainly people can continue to follow Damir's work to hear updates on how that collective process is happening with the prisoners, and you can really feel what the stakes are. It takes a lot to actually say, I'm not going to go through this trial, or for lawyers to say, I won't participate in these sort of kangaroo courts, but it shows how high the stakes are, and it's really amazing. I agree. It's so important for us to understand and to know that resistance is happening. So thank you for bringing that to us. Ayed, I wanted to turn to you next and ask again, this past weekend we were commemorating Prisoners' Day, and I wanted to ask about the case of children who are in prison and what their families are doing outside to support them, and what does Prisoners' Day mean for the families of children who are incarcerated?
I think for children and their families, almost all Palestinian children who are arrested by the Israeli authorities, this is the first time to be separated from their families. So they are not exposed to this experience before, and the problem also the uncertainty that prevails how prisoners and mainly children are treated by the Israeli authorities. So despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been arrested since the beginning of the occupation until now, and the Palestinian community is very connected to the issue of the prisoners. They may be disparate in every political issue, but when it comes to the issue of prisoners and supporting them and in every possible means, the Palestinian people and the Palestinian factions are united behind prisoners. But our knowledge, despite the fact that almost every family in Palestine, they have or passed through this experience, they do not know about how life in prison is because it's a blind spot that nobody know about it except if he passed through this experience. And I can borrow from my experience when I was in prison. And when my family was visiting me, they asked us about the food, about the treatment, about whether the guards beating us, and all these simple questions. So because they don't know exactly how Palestinians, prisoners and children mainly are treated by the Israeli authorities. So it's not clear for almost the Palestinian community, and that's why we try to raise the awareness of children about their rights when they are arrested by the Israeli authorities and how to confront the interrogation techniques because they do not know how to behave. And also we try as much as we can to visit children and provide them with legal consultation whenever we can, because we believe that the contact between the prisoner and the outside world, especially during interrogation, is very important because what the interrogator tried to convey for the Palestinian child that he is alone, nobody cares about him, he can do whatever he wants. The only way to get rid of this situation to cooperate with me and to give confessions for the allegation against you. So we use the legal consultation and the communication with the lawyer as a tool to convey a message that there is somebody who cares about you. We are in your side. And so I believe that the knowledge of the Palestinian community and for every family who has somebody in prison during this period, during Ramadan, they remember him and miss him a lot. So this issue for the Palestinian community, it's the Achilles heel. And that's why the Israeli authorities try to target Palestinians, mainly children, through the arrest because they believe that by targeting children, they can achieve their policies and Palestinians will surrender and do not resist their policies. And mainly the issue of settlement and settlement expansions because the majority of Palestinian children are arrested from places where there are frictions between the Israeli authorities and Palestinians, like nearby settlements or where there is bypass road or where Israel is trying to construct a new settlement like or confiscate Palestinian lands. So whenever there is a resistance, there is the suppression from the, so we can't disconnect between the issue of resistance and the issue of the attempts of suppressing and controlling the Palestinian people.
Thank you, Ayad. That's really, it's really powerful to hear, actually, and it sort of occurs to me as you were speaking that that tactic of trying to isolate children and make them feel alone is also a sort of metaphor for the way that the Israeli regime is trying to cut off the Palestinian community from international solidarity. So again, it kind of brings the importance back of why it's so significant for us to be paying attention to this issue and to be hearing from you. Chichi, I wanted to turn to you next. Going back again to the report that you've published last spring, there's a whole section in it about the forms of resistance undertaken by prisoners throughout time, and mentioned some of the things that Milena was talking talking about too. I wanted to ask why did you include that section in the report? What was the significance of it, and why do you think it's what does it mean for us for solidarity movements?
Yeah, so it was really important for us to include the section about resistance because firstly, because of the massive impact that the Palestinian prisoners movement has had on the wider Palestinian liberation movement, and also the fact that political prisoners are just so central to the Palestinian struggle. And in terms of solidarity, it's really essential for us not to forget this, and also to remember agency of the prisoners themselves. So we need to be amplifying their demands. We need to be speaking out against the injustice of their imprisonment, but also understanding Israel's system of arrest and detention and military courts as absolutely critical to their occupation regime overall, and not something that can be talked about separately. So yeah, like mass imprisonment is a key policy of Israel's occupation that is intended to stifle all resistance and actually to make all resistance illegal. But despite these intentions, Palestinian prisoners have historically self-organized from within Israeli prisons, and prison has actually been a hugely important space for political education, both for prisoners themselves and for Palestinian society by extension. So in the years of the first Intifada in the late 80s and early 90s, occupied Palestine had the highest incarceration rate in the world. And also this is when the strength of the Palestinian prisons movement really showed. So prisoners were self-organizing in democratic committees, and they had education programs for both academic and political education. And this then became critical in building a unified and collective resistance to both their imprisonment and against Israeli occupation. So the prisoners movement and the participatory nature of it was really formative for many Palestinian prisoners who, when they were released from prison, went on to play leading roles in the organization of the Intifada and the sort of the non-violent mass organizing that happened around that. And as we've heard from Milena, like these core principles of collective solidarity are still absolutely central in the prisoners movement today. And the military courts boycott is a really powerful collective action against the legitimacy of Israel's military court system. And it's important for us to remember that the struggle inside the prison and the struggle against mass imprisonment is an extension of the wider Palestinian resistance movement, and that the prisoner struggle is also the national struggle. So that the mass incarceration of Palestinians and the criminalization of all forms of civil and political life is part of Israel's occupation regime. And for us, in terms of solidarity, it makes it even more important that we have to resist the narrative that would seek to delegitimize Palestinian prisoners just because they are imprisoned. We need to be emphasizing that Israel's entire system of military courts, of arrest and detention is unjust and illegal, and that all Palestinian prisoners are political prisoners, so that they are imprisoned in relation to their occupation. And for this reason, their freedom is an absolutely essential element in the collective Palestinian struggle. And yeah, we need to support their resistance and recognize that their continued strength and steadfastness exemplifies that of Palestinians as a whole.
Thank you, Chichi. And actually that brings us on to the next topic that I wanted to discuss. You mentioned the sort of criminalization of civil and political activity. So I wanted to ask you both, Milena and Ayed, both of your organizations have been targeted by the Israeli authorities because of the important critical work that you've been doing. And of course, I mean, the conditions that you're working in are difficult enough already because you're working under occupation and apartheid, but it seems that it's been made even more difficult by Israel's so-called designation of 6 NGOs last October. I wanted to ask both of you to speak on this. What do you think motivated this attack on your NGOs and the others, and how is the situation now? Milena, I'll go to you first.
Thank you. So I'll just answer this with quoting Ayed. Actually, he said something that's really important. Wherever there is resistance, there is oppression. So basically, the 6 organizations that were targeted by Israel we're the leading organizations in the international level, where we were opposing the Israeli occupation's unjust policies and systematic violations. Our organizations really have been working based on international law, international human rights law, and international criminal rights law to communicate with the United Nations, with states, with policymakers to highlight the violations of the Israeli occupation. So we believe the Israeli occupation has sensed this threat that's coming from the civil society organizations in exposing their apartheid regime. So this threat is not something new. Both our organizations actually were raided by the Israeli occupations, where they entered our offices in the West Bank in Ramallah. And so both of our organizations are now criminalized. So whenever the Israeli occupation senses a threat of accountability, they start using this sinister decisions and baseless decisions. So the effect of this is felt by the services that we give. We both organizations, and I speak also about Al-Damir specifically, we've continued to support the people that we support, because Palestinian political prisoners need organizations like Al-Damir. But of course, the negative effect has been felt on some state funders who have used this designation to bow down to the political bullying by the Israeli occupation to cut some funding for organizations, although their internal investigations concluded that there is no links with any of the organizations with any military operations, meaning I'm here more specifically talking about the Union of Agriculture Work Committees, where the Dutch government, after investigations, they defunded them without any actual links. So there has been states or international organizations that do bow down to this political pressure, and this has been the negative impact. So this is why now we are calling people to take affirmative action. It's not about statements of solidarity anymore. It's about really putting pressure on your own governments to reverse such a baseless designation that many UN human rights experts have said that this is an attack against the global human rights committee. It's not about Palestine anymore. It's an attack against human rights in general.
Thank you, Milena. Could you add something to that?
I think that the main purpose of this move is to disconnect us from international support and solidarity. And the latest move have been preceded by from the Israelis in order to legitimize and silence human rights organizations, especially who are criticizing the Israeli practices and lobbying in order to put pressure in Israel and to punish Israel. So since more than 10 years, there was a campaign through Congo, through a government-organized, non-governmental organization that aims to target Palestinian and Israeli and international organizations who are criticizing the Israeli practices. So despite the fact that there was full coordination and cooperation between this civil society organization and the Israeli government, but Israel tried to disguise behind this organization and to show that civil society organizations are attacking civil society organizations, and we have nothing to do with the work of civil society organization. But when they failed in achieving their goals in full, Israel or official Israel jumped in and designate this organization in order to paralyze this organization. And so the situation is open for everything. They may arrest the staff members, close the offices, or confiscate the assets of this organization. And most importantly, it's a message for the other organizations, whether international organization or monetary organizations who are dealing with this organization, that be careful, you are dealing with terrorist organization, and you may pay the price for the connection between this organization and this terrorist organization. And we start to feel the situation through the conditions in our banking transactions that so after issuing this decision, I think that Israel achieved its goal to make people who are supporting this organization terrified and stop dealing with these organizations.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that we've noticed in some of the work that we've been doing in support of the six NGOs that were officially designated, but of course, I mean, all Palestinian NGOs are under attack, but we noticed and were told by our partners in Palestine that you can see a pattern that those who are most targeted are those who are collecting evidence to be sent to the International Criminal Court, and those organizations that are giving direct support to Palestinian communities that are on the front line of settlement expansion. So the agricultural work committees that you talked about, Milena, works with farmers who are trying to stay on their land, which is at risk of confiscation. So it's a very clear pattern, isn't it? And it's very, I wanted to raise this today because it's very important for us, first of all, to continue to support your work and to hear from both of your organizations, and for folks who are kind of following on Twitter, there's a hashtag #StandWithThe6 where you can get updates on this situation. I think the point that you made, Milena, is really important also, that we need to be pressuring our government to reject that designation for sure. Chichi, I wanted to turn to you now. This is an issue that War on Want has been raising the alarm about for some time, attacks on human rights defenders in general, in particular Palestinian civil society. And you've provided some key advice about what we should be doing here in the UK to resist these attacks. So can you speak to that? What is that advice that you give?
Yeah, so as Ayed says, part of these attacks, alongside these direct attacks on Palestinian civil society, we see attacks on Palestine solidarity internationally, including here in Britain. And so, like, the point of these attacks is to have a chilling effect and to prevent people from speaking out and supporting Palestinians, but also to distract us from some of the key issues that we really need to be raising. And so, yeah, we just have to resist this. Like, we have to remember that the attacks are designed to create discord and distraction. And yeah, so I would say that the most important thing that we can do is to always center Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle in our narrative, and to not to lose sight of this in face of everything else that's happening. So we need to continue to defend Palestinian civil society by talking about why they're being repressed, and also the vital work that they're doing. And as you mentioned, it is because of the vital work that they're being targeted. So yeah, that should be our priority, to center Palestinians and to keep talking about the great work that's being done by civil society organizations like Adamir and like DCI Palestine and many others. And as important as it is to defend our right to solidarity, often we've seen that Palestinians can become lost in this narrative, and that's not something that should be happening. So yeah, so we just need to always keep in mind why these attacks are happening in the first place, and to keep sight of the bigger picture. As part of that, we also need to resist this attempt to isolate our Palestinian partners from international civil society. So wherever possible, to platform them and to amplify their messages and their demands. And when we're faced with these attempts to cut us off from each other, it is more important than ever to remember that our key strength is as a collective. And the support for Palestinian civil society from movements and grassroots activists around the world is so important, and that we need to be strengthening these networks wherever possible and increasing the amount of support that our allies can draw on. And this means supporting them to speak with their own voice rather than allowing others to dictate the narrative. The last thing is just that we should be grounding the Palestinian struggle in this wider struggle for freedom and justice everywhere, and to keep sight of the fact that there are wider systems of oppression, and those who are responsible, many of them are, based here in Britain. And as I've mentioned, we have here a particular historical responsibility, which continues to this day. And our government still maintains incredibly close diplomatic ties with Israel and arms its apartheid regime. Corporations that are based here are profiting from human rights abuses in Palestine and also from human rights abuses around the world. And one really important way that we can support Palestinians is by working to end this complicity. So by working to end government and corporate complicity in human rights abuses, and by highlighting these wherever possible.
Thanks, Chichi. Really powerful stuff. So I want to do just a final round, a quick round. First of all, thanking all of you so much. It's been such a privilege to have you with us and to be hearing from you. But I wanted to do just sort of one last round to hear. Is there anything sort of final words that you want to leave us with? Is there anything specific that you want people to take away from our conversation tonight? And Milena, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think after Chichi's concluding remarks, that summed up pretty much what people can do, because usually the question is now, what can we do? And it's basically very simple. You tell us what you can do, because whether you are a teacher, a professor, a lawyer, or just a civil society actor, or any person or any individual of conscience, you do have not a legal responsibility, but a moral responsibility as well, to share the voices of the Palestinian people. There is always a role on each individual to put pressure on their own governments, because the governments don't listen to the Palestinians. They don't really care. They are too much into the politics about surrounding what's going on. But when individuals of their own countries put pressure on them, that is the key tool that we need your support in. Not only to stand with the 6 organizations, it's important to mention that these 6 organizations provide services to various Palestinian society actors, whether women, children, political prisoners, or researchers, or even farmers and peasants. So it's important to keep on voicing opposition against the Israeli occupation, and Chichi said it very wonderfully. Seeing the Russian-Ukraine conflict arising now, we have seen states not think twice with imposing sanctions on Russia because of its constant violation of human rights. But we see Israel on a daily basis. In one day, they've arrested 400 Palestinians, and we see complete impunity and silence towards Israeli actions. We see separation between other activities when it comes to Israel, but there is always a role to impose sanctions on Israel and hold it accountable, because that's the only way where it will end violations against Palestinian rights. And it's part of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. This is not a people asking for much. We are basically asking to live in liberty and dignity, and for our people to have their own right to exercise political, social, and cultural affairs. And this, the Israeli occupation have maintained control over and delegitimized the Palestinians' rights to self-determination, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Milena. Ayad, any last words to leave with us?
I second what Milena mentioned, that this is the right moment to impose sanctions on Israel for its more than 70 years of suppressing and violating the rights of Palestinian people. The international community should have the will in order to impose sanctions against Israel. And whenever we are speaking about punishing Israel for these practices, we are talking about legal issues that have been enshrined in international human rights conventions. And it's time also for putting pressure on your MPs in order to pressure their governments to take a stance from what's going on against Palestinian children and Palestinian people in general. And the importance of spreading the word about the experiences of Palestinian people and children, because the mainstream media do not cover the situation on the ground on a neutral and professional way. And always Israel is trying to distract the attention of the media in order to concentrate on its misinformation and disinformation. And this was very clear whenever there is Israeli oppression campaign against Palestinian people. So at the beginning of the second Intifada, when it was totally civilian, the main message that Israel tried to convey that Palestinian mothers are sending their children to the front lines in order. So the media attract this message, and they continue whenever there is atrocities committed against Palestinian people, like the invading Jenin camp, and when they mentioned that Palestinians are misusing the ambulances to transport militants from one place to another. And they repeat this thing in Gaza when there was an Israeli campaign against Gaza. And the main message at that time that Palestinians are misusing the Anarwa vehicles in order to transport the missiles. So spreading the word and writing about these atrocities and the violation that Palestinian people, mainly children, are exposing to is very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Syed. And just on those points, I mean, I want to mention that both War on Want and PSC have email actions where you can contact your MP about the issues that we spoke about tonight, about the use of administrative detention and about the detention of children. So that is a very important thing to do, because it's MPs respond to this when they hear from their constituents about it. And even in cases, you know, a lot of people will say to me, well, my MP never responds or something. But we know from the people that work in the MP's offices that getting those emails really makes a difference in the attention that they give to it. So I think that's one very important thing to do. Of course, we'll be continuing to work together with Adamir, with DCI Palestine, and with War on Want, of course, in the coming months and years. So so you can certainly hear more from all of these organizations by continuing to stay with us and coming to our events. I did want to mention also, for those of you who are in London, or if you're close enough to London, we are having an emergency demonstration this Friday from 4 to 5:30 p.m. at the Israeli embassy, specifically to focus on the escalation of Israel's violence against Palestinians, the attacks on Al-Aqsa, the attacks on the Gaza Strip, but also the attacks that are happening all over historic Palestine, certainly in the West Bank, but even in the 48 territory as well, and the mass arrests as a part of that. So it's really important for people to come out if you can, and if you can't come out, please share it on your social media. And the main message of that demonstration is going to be what Chichi was mentioning: stop arming Israel. Our government, the UK government, continues to sell weapons to Israel despite recognizing and admitting Israel's serial violations of international law. So that's a violation of the UK's own policies, and yet it continues to do it. It's so important for us to raise that call of stop arming Israel. So hope that we'll see many of you outside the Israeli embassy on Friday. You can see in the chat box the information about that demonstration. And I think I'll leave it there. I want to thank our speakers so much. It's evening here in London, but it's even later in Palestine. So thanks to Ayad and Milena especially. And please, everyone, do follow their organizations, Adamir and DCI Palestine, on Twitter. And thanks to Chichi, as always, from War on Want, who does such incredible work and is such a great partner for all of us. And thanks to all of you who have joined us here tonight.
But can
Thank
you
you.